Today, 7th August, we are now further into the third month of Ukraine's offensive, and as I discussed in my programme yesterday, Ukraine's military still seems to be very much at a standstill. There have been more Ukrainian attacks on the southern front lines near south of Orekhov. There doesn't seem to have been any progress made at all. In fact, I've even seen a report which suggests that the Russian forces in this area have actually advanced in a few places in order to apparently strengthen their positions. I'm not sure that I entirely understand the report or even trust it, but anyway, I pass it on for what it's worth. I'm not sure why the Russians would want to advance from positions that have worked very much to their advantage up to this point. There was an intense Ukrainian attack in the Remevka ledge yesterday and the day before, trying to capture another village south of Staromayorsk. It was pushed back with heavy losses for Ukraine, including tanks and armoured vehicles. This is the attack, an attack in which at an early point in the attack, a Ukrainian tank, which was trying to cross a river, a small stream to be more precise rather than a river, was hit by a Russian anti-tank weapon and overturned or sank in some way into the mud area near the stream. You can find videos of this incident. I have to say that with my eyesight, my vision issues, it's not at all clear exactly what did take place, but there is an incident of that nature and it's been fairly widely discussed. And further north, in the Bakhmut area, there are more reports that the Russians have been advancing in some places. There's also been some reports that Ukraine attempted to launch a further attack on the Berkhovka positions, but was unsuccessful, and that the Russians are holding their positions there once more, and that the Russians have also launched counterattacks in the southern areas, south of the small town of Kurdyumovka, captured by the Wagner Group, I believe, in November, one of the first places around Bakhmut to fall to the Wagner Group, a small industrial centre. Apparently, Ukrainians have been launching attacks towards it. The Russians are launching some kind of a counterattack. I'm not sure how extensive the fighting is. There's also some suggestions that the Ukrainians are trying to build up their forces near Kleshayevka with a view to launching a further attack on this village, of which all I can say is that it has been something of a graveyard up to this point for Ukrainian hopes of achieving rapid successes, or indeed any successes, in the Bakhmut area. And yesterday I discussed how the Wall Street Journal, a reporter there, has spoken of the Ukrainian forces being tired, lacking enough men and machines to break through and to recapture Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, and how it seems that even in this area the Ukrainian offensive is now ebbing. This area where up to fairly recently the Ukrainians were claiming the greatest success. And last but not least, the Russians, as I reported yesterday, appear to have captured a village on the northern front lines. They still seem to be pushing steadily towards the Oskol River. It's gradual, methodical progress of the sort that the Russians do. I doubt that the Russian forces are very large. At the moment, my impression is that the Russians are still waiting to see how this Ukrainian offensive evolves. They don't want to commit all their forces to an offensive when, for all they know, perhaps the Ukrainians might still have some cards to play in their offensives further to the south. So I don't think that large numbers of Russian troops are involved in this offensive in the northern parts of the front line. But it is clear that however large the Russian offensive is, however large the forces the Russians have committed to this offensive are, the Ukrainians, for their part, are finding it very difficult indeed to push back and to hold the Russians back. So, steady but incremental Russian advances in the north, so far a complete standstill in the south, though both in the Vremevka ledge area and in the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainians have either attempted attacks, which so far have failed, as in the Vremevka ledge area, or they might be planning more attacks, as may be the case in the Bakhmut area. So overall, static front lines, and I said that we are now well into the third month of Ukraine's offensive, but we've now also, of course, passed the first week of August, and I and other Russian officials and commentators, including General Medvedev, the overall commander of Russian forces in the north, have suggested that perhaps due to munitions issues, the fact that Ukraine's stock of shells is apparently running down, it might be difficult for Ukraine to sustain this offensive beyond the end of August. So that point now is starting to appear over the event horizon. It's only 3 weeks away. We'll see what exactly happens at that point, whether Ukraine actually tries or is able to continue this offensive beyond the end of August. But to reiterate again, it is an offensive which has not achieved the results that many people in the West had expected, that many people in Ukraine had been led to believe. It's so far managed to capture around 100 square kilometers of territory, which the Russians previously controlled, that might have diminished the area of Russian control a little, some suggest by as much as 0.01%. But against that must be set the Russian advances in the north, which I suspect by now have captured at least as much territory as Ukraine has captured in its offensive in the south. People who make those calculations about the total amount of territory that Ukraine has captured and how the extent to which that reduces territory under Russian control are, in my opinion, not looking at the Russian territorial gains in the north. Now, I think we've now reached that point where it's becoming increasingly difficult, even for Ukrainian and Western commentators, to deny that the offensive is failing. There's been various reports in the media in the West suggesting that the offensive still has some way to go, holding out hopes that a breakthrough might still happen. Well, that's not been the case up to now, and it's increasingly looking unlikely that it will. One can't entirely discount the possibility. War is such an unpredictable thing, but I have to say that it is looking to be increasingly unlikely. And I should say that there's a thread of comments by a Ukrainian commentator who's somebody apparently with a military background. I don't know the actual identity of this person. He's very careful in what he says and what he says about himself. But this individual has carried out an examination of Russian forces, and he's taken issue with the claim, very common in the West, that Russia has run out of reserves. He says that the extent to which Russia still retains reserves is being underestimated. The Russians do in fact have hundreds of tanks which have not been committed to the fighting, thousands of troops which have not been committed to the fighting, and in fact that this theory, actively promoted by people like, for example, the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, that the Russian lines are overextended and overstretched, and that the Russians themselves are becoming exhausted in terms of manpower and reserves and equipment. This person doubts that that is actually the case. Personally, I see no evidence at all that this is the case. It seems to me that people who are saying these things are willfully or otherwise ignoring the evidence, which on the contrary points to a growing Russian build-up. Now, alongside the fact that, as I said, there doesn't seem to be much chance of a breakthrough, we have been seeing Ukraine increasingly resorting to what you might describe as drone and aerial warfare. And this Ukrainian commentator who I was talking about, who looked at the state of Russia's reserve forces and concluded that they were greater than many people suspect, he made an observation, he made a claim that Ukraine's best chance of success is through continuing its attacks on the battlefield. It shouldn't give up now. Its prospects on the battlefield may not be bright, but it has no real alternative, according to this person, but to continue fighting very much in the way that it has been fighting, and also to wait for that political collapse in Moscow, which it is now increasingly clear is Ukraine's great hope of success in this war. Meanwhile, on the US side, there's been comments in the Wall Street Journal, which I have to say I found deeply concerning. It says that members of the United States government, I presume that means officials in the administration, are now starting to say that the failure of Ukraine's offensive has actually reduced the prospect of peace talks. The reasoning behind this is that if the offensive had been successful, that would have forced the Russians to the negotiating table. With the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, now on the brink of failure, the Russians are not incentivized to negotiate, at least not in the way that the United States was hoping that they would. And I have to say that this comment, at one and the same time, fills me with deep misgivings, but it does two things. It clarifies the American position, and secondly, it also exposes the falsehood of American claims, going all the way back to an article which appeared in the New York Times in the summer of last year, penned supposedly by President Biden himself, in which President Biden was appearing to say that the United States is not interested in supporting Ukraine's maximalist objectives, and that the Ukrainians should not have false expectations of this, that its objective nonetheless was to put Ukraine in a strong position to pursue negotiations with Moscow, and that this was the purpose of US arms supplies. Well, that was what the president said last year, and when he wrote it, I took some comfort from it. It seemed to me that it looked like the US government might be seriously looking towards some kind of negotiation format in an effort to bring the war to an end. And in fact, we've had similar statements from US officials ever since that article in the New York Times, that the US's objective is to bring Russia to the negotiating table. But then it became increasingly clear that Ukraine itself was not interested in negotiations, and that the terms that Ukraine was saying, that the conditions that Ukraine was placing for negotiations, was a peace plan supposedly put forward by President Zelensky in the autumn, which basically demanded Russia's surrender, the total withdrawal of all Russian forces from every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And at that point, once the Russians had withdrawn and in effect capitulated, that was the point where Ukraine would start negotiations. Though what the terms that would then be negotiated would be, what those negotiations would be about, I, for one, found it very difficult to understand, given that at that point Ukraine would have won. Well, it's become increasingly clear to me over the last year, and especially since President Zelensky put his peace plan together, that the original American plan was essentially to get the Russians to capitulate on the basis of President Zelensky's plan. That when the US was talking about forcing the Russians to the negotiating table, what they really meant was forcing the Russians to agree to Zelensky's plan. In other words, to surrender, to capitulate. And as it is becoming increasingly clear that with the failure of the offensive, that objective is unrealizable, the United States is not rethinking its negotiating strategy. Rather, it is cooling on the entire idea of talks. It doesn't actually want talks. It doesn't want talks with Russia that might lead to an unsatisfactory compromise from a US point of view, which could be exploited by President Biden's political opponents in the United States as evidence of his foreign policy failure in his most important foreign policy issue, which is the war in Ukraine, and besides which the United States really isn't keen on negotiations, substantive negotiations with the Russians at all, because it is, of course, concerned that if such negotiations ever did begin, then they would lead to an opening up of the question of the security situation in Europe generally, which is where the United States does not wish to go. So the failure of the offensive, the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, some in the most awful conditions. Again, if you watch the film coming out of the battlefronts, you would understand how awful some of those conditions in which Ukrainian soldiers have to fight and die or get severely wounded, how awful those conditions are. Well, all of that, all that it's resulting is, if anything, a cooling in the United States, within the administration, at the prospect of negotiations with the Russians, a worry that if negotiations do now take place, the United States, and of course Ukraine, will be negotiating from a weaker position rather than a stronger one, and might be pushed into more concessions than is acceptable. That's a dismal prospect, but I think that is the realistic one. And we also see this being coupled with certain comments of President Zelensky's. President Zelensky has spoken now about the fact that he is worried that with the offensive visibly failing, the United States might start to look for ways not to ramp up its support for Ukraine, but to start to crank it down. And he is also worried that Western states, and here I suspect he means primarily the European states, might start to increase pressure upon him to enter into negotiations with the Russians and to be prepared to make concessions. And he is also clearly becoming concerned about the reduction in arms supplies from the West. Now, he has just received a further tranche of arms supplies. These are the 40 Scalp missiles, very similar but not identical to the British Storm Shadows that have just arrived from France. And in fact, he's had himself photographed scribbling something on the side of one of these missiles. And yesterday, the Ukrainian Air Force launched a missile strike towards two bridges in the north of Crimea, linking Crimea with Kherson region. Now, here we are very dependent once more on Russian accounts of what happened. The Ukrainians have reported this incident in somewhat triumphalist terms, but it's the Russians who provided us with details. Now, again, let me reiterate, these are Russian claims. I can't corroborate them. It may be that there are elements of exaggeration, but they are what we have. And in general, overall, these sort of Russian claims, once corroboration starts to appear, they turn out to be true. Anyway, it seems, this is what the Russians say, that up to 12 Storm Shadows were launched towards these two bridges at the same time. Now, this is becoming increasingly the pattern. Ukraine, as I've noticed for some time, isn't launching individual Storm Shadows at particular targets. It's increasingly launching Storm Shadows in large volleys. Now, that must be a fairly complicated operation. Ukraine is said to have between a dozen and 17 Sukhoi 24 fighter bombers, the only aircraft up to now in the Ukrainian Air Force which are capable of launching Storm Shadow missiles, though it's been suggested that some of the Sukhoi 27 fighter jets that Ukraine also possesses could also do so. But there are relatively few of those, and they are urgently needed by Ukraine because they continue to be vitally important air superiority fighter jets. Indeed, they are the best fighter jets that Ukraine has. So anyway, Ukraine only has, well, let's be optimistic and say it's got 17 Sukhoi 24s. Now, I don't know how many Storm Shadow missiles a Sukhoi 24 jet can carry, but I'm going to guess it's 2. Photographs that I've seen of Sukhoi 24s carrying Storm Shadows appear to suggest that they carry just 2. After all, these are large missiles, relatively large missiles. So if you're going to launch 12 of these airborne missiles, then you have to have 6 Sukhoi 24s in the air at one time. So this is a large operation. Bear in mind that the Russians are now attacking the airfields from which the Sukhoi 24s operate. The major one, Starokonstantinov, was attacked over the course of Russia's major missile barrage of a day or so ago. The satellite photos which show fires on the airstrip of this once huge Soviet airbase, and the likelihood is that Starokonstantinov, for the moment at least, is out of operation. But there are other airfields. Ukraine does have other airfields from which these aircraft can take off. Soviet aircraft need, in general, shorter runways than Western aircraft can, or so I understand, and they're better adapted at working on less prepared runways than US aircraft and Western aircraft can. So the Ukrainians can, it seems, still send up into the sky as many as six of these Sukhoi 24s and launch a single missile barrage and volley of 12 Storm Shadow missiles. But why are they doing this? Why are they shooting so many Storm Shadow missiles at once? After all, this is supposed to be a long-range cruise missile. It's the kind of weapon system that I would have thought is designed to work through fairly long distance through defences. It's not perhaps the system that one would expect to be used in this kind of way to launch large volleys. And of course, sending up as many as 6 Sukhoi 24 aircraft all in one go does place those aircraft at risk. It makes it more likely that these aircraft, no doubt all in different locations, but nonetheless that some of these aircraft will be spotted by Russian air defences, which will then be on the alert, and that at least some of these fighter bombers, of which, as I said, Ukraine doesn't have an unlimited number, might find themselves shot down. So why are the Ukrainians doing this? Well, I think, assuming this Russian claim that 12 of these Storm Shadow missiles were launched at one go, it's because the Russians are having increasing success in shooting down Storm Shadow missiles. So instead of shooting them, launching them one or two at a time, the Ukrainians are trying to overwhelm defences by launching them in larger numbers at one and the same time. And they've been doing this now for about 2 weeks. Now, the results, however, again, if the Russians are to be believed, are not comforting for Ukraine. 12 missiles are launched. According to the Russians, 9 were shot down. 1 was brought down through electronic jamming, probably quite close to the targets, by the way. 2, however, did get through, each one attacking a different bridge linking Crimea to Kherson region. One of these bridges is the Chongar bridge, which Ukraine has attacked before. Now, this account of the volley of missiles all launched at once and of 9 or 10 of these missiles being brought down, this is entirely a Russian claim. But as I will say shortly, it's not inconsistent with things that have happened in the past. When the HIMARS missiles were first deployed back in the summer of last year, Ukraine was able to launch them in discrete numbers, and at that time the Russian air defense system was having trouble shooting them down, and they were able to reach Russian positions, Russian ammunition depots and deployment places behind the Russian front lines, and they were able to do a certain amount of damage. They were also successfully used, or at least they certainly hit successfully, the Antonovsky Bridge, connecting Kherson city on the west bank of the Dnieper River with the Russian-controlled east bank of Kherson region of the Dnieper, the east bank, which is in the eastern part of Kherson region. So the HIMARS was initially able to penetrate through Russian defenses, and the Russians were having difficulties shooting these missiles down. But over time, the Russians began to get on top of the challenge represented by the HIMARS, and they started to shoot these missiles down with increasing success. And this has been acknowledged in the Western media. They were able to jam the signals that the HIMARS relied upon, and the Panzer point defense system became increasingly adept at shooting these missiles down. And so the Ukrainians, when they continued to use the HIMARS missile, missile system, which by the way they continue to do to this day, increasingly resorted to the practice which we're now seeing alleged over their use with the Storm Shadows, launching volleys of these missiles at the same time, accepting that some of them will be intercepted and shot down or brought down through electronic jamming, but hoping that at least a few, one or two, will get through. And that seems to be the pattern with the Storm Shadows. Except, of course, that the number of Storm Shadows and Scout missiles is finite. It's probably already been depleted to some degree. I understand that Britain and France no longer manufacture this missile, so losses can't be replaced, or missiles expended can't be replaced. And launching missiles in volleys, of course, reduces the number of targets you're able to attack if you would be able to use the Storm Shadow in the way that it was designed as a sort of point attack missile. Anyway, there we go. This is the Russian claims. 9 shot down, 1 jammed, 2 got through, both doing certain amount of damage to the bridge. This is the Russian account. And as I said again, we can't fully corroborate it, but it is not that different from what happened with the HIMARS, which is, I think, widely acknowledged. And one thing we can corroborate are Russian claims about the extent of the damage done to the 2 bridges. And there has been some damage. Both cases, the road surfaces, there's been holes punched through the road surfaces, but both bridges are certainly intact. The damage is limited, and the Russians say that both bridges will be operating within a few days, that in fact repairing the bridges isn't going to take very long. The Russians also say that these attacks on these bridges are attacks on civilian infrastructure, that they're not used by the military anymore. The reason is that with the Russians controlling the land bridge, with the railways that pass through this land bridge now under Russian control, most Russian supplies reach the front lines in Zaporozhye region and in Kherson through trains sent directly from Russia. They're not sent via Crimea. Now, that's what the Russians claim. Again, I don't know whether that is true, but I have no reason to disbelieve it. So, Ukraine has had another batch of missiles, Scout missiles from France, but they're not proving the decisive game changer in this offensive. They're not proving as effective as the HIMARS systems proved for a short period in the summer and autumn of last year. And I suspect that overall the result of the use of these missiles has been disappointing. But coming back to Zelensky's concerns, it is becoming increasingly clear that other weapon systems, supplies of other weapon systems from the West, are starting to dwindle. Now, Europe appears to have basically run out of Leopard 2s that it can send to Ukraine. And of course, the British have also run out of Challenger 2s that they can send to Ukraine. Germany is going to supply Leopard 1s, but deliveries of Leopard 1s have been slow. Now, some people assume that there is some kind of political reason or explanation for this. I don't think so myself. These tanks, these Leopard 1s, are old tanks which have had to be taken out of store. They need re-equipping and refurbishing. That process is probably proving more complicated and more difficult than the German government and the German authorities expected. So that is why only a small number of Leopard 1s have been delivered to Ukraine up to this point, and no doubt more will come. The total apparently that's to be delivered is around 150, but I gather there's only about 10 of them in Ukraine at the moment, and they're not yet deployed to the front lines. And as I've discussed already, they are in any case not a match for Russian tanks. They have thin armour and a light gun, and based on what we have seen happen to the far more heavily protected Leopard 2s, they're unlikely to survive for very long on the battlefield if they're deployed in action. So the prospect of getting many more tanks from Europe is now basically running down. The prospect of getting more armoured vehicles from Europe is also running down. The United States can supply more tanks. It's still got significant numbers of tanks in store, and it's still got significant numbers of Bradleys and Strykers, infantry fighting vehicles, in store. But I'm getting the sense that the Pentagon is becoming worried at the speed with which Ukraine is going through these machines. And it seems that the United States, the Pentagon, has put its foot down in terms of two other weapons deliveries. It seems that the United States, the Pentagon, has made it absolutely clear that it does not want to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. This is not, I think, because of worries that the supply of ATACMS crosses any red lines. It is because stocks of this missile are small, and the missile, the ATACMS, is at the centerpiece of the Pentagon's plans to build up defenses in the Pacific against China. So there is a general reluctance to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. But the other big story, in fact, the even more interesting story, is that the Pentagon is clearly cooling. In fact, it's turned icily cold on the, frankly, ill-conceived plan to supply F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. The United States, the Pentagon, was never enthusiastic about this idea. I think they understand very well that F-16s, relatively old aircraft as these are, some of them, they would be taken out of European stocks. They're old Cold War veteran machines. They might not work that effectively today. There would be no match for the increasingly powerful and advanced fighter force that the Russians are able to deploy. And of course, they would be no match either for the enormously sophisticated air defense system that the Russians have. Also, I think the Pentagon understands that the problems of operating these fighter jets from Ukrainian airfields are overwhelmingly complex. The airfields were, even before the war, were not up to standard. They were not fit to operate these tricky, high maintenance machines. They require clean and smooth airstrips. The ones in Ukraine are neither of those things. And of course, the Russians have just shown their ability to attack these airstrips at will, and that makes it even more difficult. That makes it all but impossible, in fact, for the United States to supply F-16s that could operate from them. There was the theory, the plan, I think, to base these F-16s not at Ukraine itself, but in neighbouring NATO countries, Poland and Romania in particular. And of course, Romania would have been particularly important because that would have brought F-16s in closer range to Crimea and potentially able to intervene over the southern front lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. However, the Russians reacted very strongly to that idea. The Russian Foreign Ministry pointed out that these aircraft are dual purpose. They can carry nuclear weapons. The Russians said that they would interpret this as a potential nuclear threat, that they reserve the right to take corresponding decisions in response, all very alarming to the United States. And of course, anyway, the idea of basing aircraft on NATO territory, which would then participate in fighting in Ukraine, well, that could conceivably create a whole pattern of escalation, which is where the Pentagon really doesn't want to go. It's all very well, perhaps, sneaking drones, seaborne drones, down the Romanian coast, and getting them launched towards places like Novorossiysk and wherever. That gives you a chance to, an opportunity for denial, if you please. But the United States can't conceal the operation of F-16s from Romanian and Polish airspace. And with the Russians threatening counteraction, I think people in the Pentagon have looked at all of this, decided that the whole plan is ill-conceived. As several US officials have said all along, the number of F-16s that could realistically be supplied is not going to change the dynamic of the battlefield anyway. And so, for all those reasons, the United States has quietly decided to shelve this whole idea. Of course, they don't want to say that openly because doing so might expose them to criticism. So they're coming up with various reasons why it can't be done. They've already explained why it won't change the course of the battlefield. But now they're saying that there aren't enough Ukrainian pilots with the necessary proficiency in English to undertake training on these machines. The number of pilots, Ukrainian pilots, with that necessary proficiency is just 8, which hardly makes it worthwhile. And therefore, once more, it looks as if this whole plan to train Ukrainian pilots to fly these aircraft, these complex and difficult aircraft, well, that plan apparently looks like it's going to be postponed again. I'm going to say briefly that I take this claim that these pilots lack the necessary proficiency in English with a healthy dose of skepticism. I would have thought that that amongst the people in Ukraine who probably do possess a certain level of proficiency in English, fighter pilots who are by definition educated and skilled people are likely to be disproportionately represented. But putting that aside, I can remember how just a few weeks ago, months ago, when the idea of training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s was first being floated, there was supposed to be a pilot training program, a brief pilot training program to see whether or not this was possible. And there was reports that the Pentagon people were impressed at how quickly Ukrainian pilots learnt to fly the F-16s. They only needed 4 months, supposedly, not years to do it. So that was a few months ago. Now the story has changed completely. It would take at least a year. Again, we're hearing to bring Ukrainian pilots up to the necessary standard. We have this problem that they don't speak English well enough to do it properly. Well, to me, as I said, that looks like an intention to postpone this idea and, in fact, to bury it or to kick it into the long grass. There has been, in my opinion, one political victim to the F-16 saga, who is the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. A couple of weeks ago, we were hearing stories that he was angling to be appointed NATO Secretary General. The United States blocked his appointment, and much to the dismay, by the way, of the British media. And then shortly after, we heard that he was actually resigning and leaving the government and quitting politics altogether. And I think that there's been various explanations for this. The likely defeat of the Conservative Party in the general election next year being one. The fact that Ben Wallace probably can read the writing on the wall in terms of the offensive in Ukraine, of which he's been such a passionate supporter, and doesn't want to be around when defeat eventually comes, being another. But I suspect that his relationship with the United States has also deteriorated. The United States apparently blames him specifically for pushing the whole idea of supplying F-16s to Ukraine. That was the main reason, apparently, why they blocked his appointment as NATO Secretary General. And it could very well be that with the Americans not happy with Ben Wallace, they already had some issues with him at the end of last year when they were worried that information was leaking from Britain. I remember he had to do a sudden dash to Washington to explain himself and to explain what was going on. Anyway, I think that the F-16 saga was the last straw, and the Americans are angry with him for having, or so they felt, tried to push them into this F-16 delivery idea. And probably he understands that a British Defence Secretary has limited effectiveness unless he has the backing of the United States. And that is why he is now pulling out. So, coming back to Zelensky, he's now looking at the fact that he's not going to get perhaps some of the shiny new weapons that he was hoping for from the United States. And he's not going to get the ATACMS, he's not going to get the F16s. The Europeans are running out of tanks. The British basically have no tanks, not in anything like the numbers that they can send to him. The Americans are cooling, as I said, on the really useful weapons that he needs. They don't seem keen to send M1 Abrams tanks or ATACMS missiles or F16s. And so he's now made a further statement. Yesterday I discussed his statements that he's trying to launch a diplomatic push, trying to persuade the global south countries to rally to the support of Ukraine, to try to get the global south countries to change their positions on the Ukrainian conflict so as to avoid having to make the diplomatic concessions to the Russians, which he might have to make in order to avoid a total defeat, or if he's pushed into negotiations by the West. Now he's doing something else. He's talking apparently on his Telegram channel about a general mobilization, a total mobilization of Ukraine's remaining manpower, all Ukrainian men who can carry weapons, perhaps Ukrainian women also, try to call them all up, a levée en masse, as it used to be called in France, trying again to change the situation on the battlefields by outnumbering the Russians in that kind of way. And he's apparently said on his Telegram channel that it's become increasingly clear that in order to get themselves through this situation, a rather bleak comment in itself, Ukraine can only in the end rely on itself. And in fact, we've been getting now, on top of the periodic statements from Ukrainian officials that the reason their offensive isn't successful is because they weren't provided with all the weapons they needed, and comments to that effect by Ukrainian soldiers who meet Western journalists. Anyway, we are now getting more reports that at least I'm seeing reports that we're starting to get open criticisms, not just of the United States and of the Western powers for the failure to supply sufficient weapons deliveries appearing in the Ukrainian media, but also things like cartoons critical of the West also beginning to appear in Ukrainian social media, perhaps orchestrated by the government. So a narrative is being constructed in Ukraine. And coming back to this war, it's again important to remember that for the West and for Ukraine, this war is all about narratives. A narrative is being constructed that if the offensive has failed, if Ukraine is in increasingly desperate plight, it is because the West has failed to supply Ukraine with all the weapons that Ukraine needs, and it's therefore left to Ukraine to fight this war alone and by itself with all the manpower that it can mobilize. All of this alongside the narrative that we see in the United States and in the West, that if the offensive has failed, it's not because Ukraine hasn't been supplied with the weapons it's needed, it's because Ukraine hasn't followed the advice, the training that the West gave it. It hasn't learnt to use these wonderful combined arms tactics successfully. So, this, it looks like, is the current Ukrainian narrative, and it's being conducted alongside increasingly vitriolic complaints by Ukraine against some of its allies. And very interestingly, the ally that's been specifically targeted is Poland. There's now increasing criticism of Poland in Ukraine. The Polish ambassador was called into the Ukrainian foreign ministry to receive a protest from Ukraine. An extraordinary step, by the way. This is usually a relatively rare action in diplomacy, in the world of diplomacy. And I have to say that the cause behind this remarkable action, some statements made by some Polish officials, seems to me entirely disproportionate to the Ukrainian reaction. And again, it does make me wonder whether this was just a pretext. It was Ukraine again looking to blame its allies, in this case Poland, for its plight. Anyway, it's now been followed up by comments by Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's top advisors. He said that Poland will only be a friend of Ukraine for so long as the war continues. After the war has ended, Poland will cease to be a friend. And that has gone down extremely badly in Poland, unsurprisingly enough. And one can see again tensions that are starting to develop. And again, I can't help but wonder whether this is also part of the narrative as Ukraine's allies increasingly blame Ukraine for the failure of the offensive. Ukraine, in its turn, is starting to blame its allies for the failure of the offensive. In one case, it's because the Ukrainians aren't adopting Western tactics. In the other case, because they're not adopting enough weapons. I have to say that Zelensky's ideas of launching some kind of diplomatic offensive in the global south to turn things round and mobilizing the entire manpower of Ukraine, to my mind, these are acts of desperation. There is no prospect at all of the global south being mobilized in the way that Zelensky wants. We're now getting more and more information about what took place in Jeddah, and that should make the fact completely clear. Jeddah, this conference in Saudi Arabia, I've already discussed it extensively. I've said that it was clearly designed by the United States to happen in conjunction with Ukraine's anticipated breakthrough in the offensive. It was going to result in more pressure on Russia. That was the plan, to accept Zelensky's peace plan, in other words, to capitulate. But with no breakthrough, with no sign of a breakthrough, that plan was stillborn, and the Jeddah summit lost its intended purpose. It turns out that things have gone even worse than I had anticipated. Firstly, I should say that contrary to what I had understood and what I had seen reported, Brazil did in the end send a representative to this summit. But it also became clear that the United States lost control of the summit. We're now getting lots of reports. It seems that the Brazilian representative made it absolutely clear that in future, if meetings like this were to take place, Russia should certainly be invited to attend them. It seems that all the states of the global south, including, of course, the BRICS states, made it absolutely clear that Zelensky's plan was a non-starter. None of them agreed to support it. And in fact, what happened instead was that Saudi Arabia, which was chairing the conference, presented its own plan. That was for a ceasefire, a freezing of the conflict along the current front lines, and an exchange of prisoners, with further negotiations for some sort of a political settlement. Now, that is, by the way, a proposal which is not going to be terribly welcome in Moscow, but it is not going to be welcome at all in Kiev. The Ukrainians, if they were to be forced to accept a proposal like this, would be forced to accept that their prospects of regaining control of all their lost territories have melted away. And for the moment, Ukraine is standing firm in rejecting all of these ideas, and it is inconceivable that Saudi Arabia's peace plan at the least would be accepted, at least by the present Ukrainian government, at any rate at this particular point in time. Now, the Russians, for their part, will probably be happy by that. The Russians would be very loath to accept a peace proposal on these lines, freezing the conflict in this way. But the Ukrainians, as some Russian officials, including Medvedev, have said, are making it easy for the Russians, because by rejecting all of these proposals, the Russians are not put in a situation where they have to reject them as well. So that tells us, anyway, that a Ukrainian attempt to get the global south to change its position is simply not going to work. So that's simply not going to happen, and Zelensky is deluding himself if he thinks it will. Now, the second, the general mobilization idea, is a disastrous one. There's a lot of discussion as to exactly what the true level of Ukraine's population, by which I mean the number of people who are currently living in the territory of Ukraine, which is under the Ukrainian government's control, not the total number of Ukrainians across the world, in Europe, in Russia, in other places, but in the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government is. I've seen guesstimates varying from as low as 20 million to somewhere just above 30 million. But it is certainly a huge decline from before the war, or from the time when Ukraine gained its independence. And scooping up whoever can bear weapons and throw them into the battlefield in the face of this demographic crisis, well, not only is it heartless for the people involved, one has to beg the question, how is Zelensky, how is his government, his military, going to train all these people? The idea of throwing hundreds of thousands of men into battle with insufficient training against the increasingly proficient and increasingly well-equipped Russian army is going to compound the human tragedy of Ukraine even further. But it's also going to deal a massive blow to any prospect Ukraine might have of regenerating itself after the war. This is a disastrous idea, but it tells us a great deal about the mindset within the Ukrainian government and about the crisis in Ukraine. One can only feel pessimistic and depressed, but that seems to be the direction the Zelensky government is taking. The Zelensky government is being compounded in this folly by the United States, where the administration also, as I discussed earlier in the program, is also cooling on the idea of negotiations in light of the failure of Ukraine's offensive. It seems to me that those people in Russia, including Putin himself, who say that this war is going to be waged to the last Ukrainian, are looking like they're going to be increasingly right. Well, that's all I'm going to say about Ukraine. Ukraine is not the only crisis in the world, and two are now developing fast. The first, I have to say, is in Pakistan, where the legal processes which have been brought against Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister who was pushed out of office in what his supporters and he himself see as a constitutional coup, orchestrated, or perhaps I should say a parliamentary coup, orchestrated to some extent at least by the US Embassy and backed by the military. Anyway, he has been the target of what looks to me to be straightforward lawfare, endless legal attacks to prevent him and his party participating in the elections, which are due in, I believe, in October in Pakistan. He's now been found guilty on various counts through a legal process which both he and his supporters reject the legitimacy of. It looks like there's going to be more protests, more unrest in Pakistan. For the moment, the government and the military seem to have the situation just about under control. Perhaps there's even been some loss of momentum in the protests over the last few weeks. But the situation remains very tense and very volatile. And of course, as the elections approach, it seems to me highly likely, indeed more probable than not, that tensions in Pakistan are going to increase, and we could very well be faced with a major crisis in what is, of course, nowadays a nuclear power, and one where the economy, by the way, is in bad shape. Well, we could see a major crisis begin to develop in Pakistan in the autumn. A nuclear power, one strategically located at the heart of Central Asia, a strong ally of China, historically a friend of the United States, a country which has been supplying 155mm shells to the United States for onward transmission to Ukraine, according to some reports, and a country which at the same time is seeking to forge closer economic links and to import oil and gas from Russia. Country, in other words, that is important, and it is becoming increasingly unstable. A country which, as well as being a nuclear power, is also very large, and a country which has a complex relationship with India, which has often been in conflict with India, and which has fought two wars, some would say more wars even than that, at least armed conflicts with India, which can spiral out of control at any time. A very dangerous situation, and I have to say that irrespective of what you may think of Imran Khan, and I've heard many Pakistanis voice criticisms of him. They say that he was not a particularly successful prime minister when he was in office, but whatever you may think of him, it seems to me that this whole affair has been disastrously mismanaged, and it does suggest that there are elements within the Pakistani political establishment that, frankly, have lost control or lost their understanding of the situation in Pakistan, and are prepared to place their own narrow interests above the more important issue, which is the political stability of their nation. Anyway, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on Pakistani politics, but it does seem to me a very dangerous situation overall. And of course, the other main point of crisis now is West Africa. It is Niger. The new military authorities there, which seized power a few days ago, have now rejected the ultimatum from the ECOWAS states to restore the civilian president to office. They seem to be calling on the Wagner organization in Russia for help. I've seen some suggestions that the Wagner organization might indeed be thinking about moving to Niger. I should make it very clear that I've seen no conclusive evidence that they are indeed there at all. There was film being circulated about a day ago of a Ilyushin 76 Russian aircraft flying into the main airfield, the airport of Niger's capital, and there was speculation that on board this Russian aircraft were Wagner fighters. I have to say two things about this. Firstly, I understand there's some questions about the authenticity of that video, and secondly, it's not, of course, only Wagner that uses Ilyushin 76 aircraft. It's not even just Russian airlines and the Russian authorities who use these aircraft. To my certain knowledge, they're used extensively, including by UN and humanitarian agencies in Africa for logistics, supplies, and other operations. They're extremely effective at operating from poorly maintained airfields, more effective in doing that than comparable Western aircraft are, and they are strongly favoured for operations in places like Africa for that very reason. So even if this is a genuine film of a real Ilyushin 76 flying into Niger, it doesn't prove that the Wagner fighters are on it, even if it's Russian, and it might not even be Russian. So I don't place a huge amount of credence in that. But it must be said that this is a dangerous situation. The Niger authorities have now closed the airfields. They're moving apparently troops to the borders with Nigeria and Senegal. Local states are lining up for and against the military authorities in Niger. Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso have announced their support for the coup and their opposition to any intervention in Niger by the ECOWAS grouping. Mali and Burkina Faso have talked about a potential declaration of war. They're seeing it as an act of war against themselves if ECOWAS does intervene in Niger. Algeria has spoken out against an ECOWAS intervention as well, and it has large and formidable armed forces. And there does seem to be some disagreement and dissension about whether to intervene on the part of the ECOWAS states. I understand that the Nigerian Senate and perhaps the Nigerian Parliament have voted against intervention, but it seems that the Nigerian President and the Chief of Staff of the Nigerian Army are still strongly inclined to that idea, and there's also been demands for intervention from Senegal as well. So the possibility of intervention remains strong. Meanwhile, the government of Niger has demanded that all French forces leave Niger. They've closed Niger's airspace. I believe they're making the same demands of the US forces in Niger as well. We'll see what happens in connection with that. And we will see what happens and whether ECOWAS does in the end decide to intervene or not, as the case may be. I would say that if ECOWAS does intervene, especially if Nigeria and Senegal intervene, and both have significant militaries, far more powerful than that of Niger, which is quite small and with only a limited air force. it would be a lopsided intervention. I can't imagine that it would be difficult for Nigeria, for the Nigerian army, to battle its way through to the capital and perhaps even to restore the president to office. But it seems to me that there's also a real possibility that that is when the real problems, the real crisis would begin, because though it's difficult for me to get a full measure of how much popular support the military leadership in Niger does possess, it does appear to have a certain amount of support, at least in the capital, and in my experience, what tends to consolidate opposition to a government that's been restored to power in a country is a perception that it has been reimposed on that country by outside powers. So the possibility of a conflict in Niger expanding and escalating out of control remains. As I said, that's probably more what is deterring governments in the ECOWAS area from intervening than, as I said, a fear of the Niger armed forces. But of course, there's also, in addition, the concern that this conflict might escalate and rapidly spiral out of control. Anyway, we will see what happens, and we will see whether this coup stabilizes, whether the doubts that exist within the ECOWAS grouping within Nigeria and Senegal, apparently also to some extent now, and Côte d'Ivoire, another state that seems to be sympathetic to intervention, whether these doubts are strong enough to deter an intervention, or whether the intervention will take place, and if so, what effect it will have. Anyway, that is the situation in West Africa. I'm not going to pretend again that I'm an expert on the politics of Niger, but the stakes are rising. The danger of intervention is increasing. President Macron of France, in my opinion, is making the situation worse by talking about retaliation against French citizens, retaliation from France in the event of any action, hostile actions against French citizens, of which, by the way, I see no sign at all, with dark hints of airstrikes from France and such things. Well, I don't think that is helpful at all in this situation, and we will just have to see where this situation goes. But even though the main crisis in the world today continues, in my opinion, to be Ukraine, we can see that conflict situations do arise in other places. Both the one in Pakistan and the one in Niger have the potential to get out of control. That is not, by the way, to say that they will do, but of course, what the point I'm making is that they're both conflicts with real dangers, and of course, the conflict in Sudan also remains essentially unresolved as well. I haven't been discussing that much either, but we have multiple conflicts in many places around the world, even as the international focus remains on Ukraine. And the risk, of course, is that with the focus so overwhelmingly on Ukraine, any one of these crises could spiral out of control. Well, that's all I'm going to say about what's going on in these other crises. This is the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You should also check out our shop, where you can buy all the amazing things that you will find our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.